A young waiter mocks Joseph Toney, thinking he's just another customer who doesn't belong. But when NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal walks in and reveals their connection, the entire diner is stunned. What happens next is a lesson in respect and humility that leaves everyone speechless and inspired. Watch this powerful moment unfold as Shaq turns judgment into a lesson in kindness and second chances. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that prove respect matters. It was a quiet evening at a small-town diner, the kind of place where regulars filled the booths and the smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. Joseph Toney walked in, his weathered jacket and well-worn boots a testament to the hard life he had lived. He had the kind of presence that demanded little attention, just another man looking for a warm meal after a long day. Joseph glanced around, taking a seat at a corner booth. The diner wasn't crowded, and a few waitstaff moved between tables, chatting casually with customers. One of the waiters, a young man named Todd, caught sight of Joseph and immediately frowned. Todd was known for his sharp tongue and even sharper judgments, and Joseph's simple attire seemed to spark something disdainful in him. Todd approached the table, his expression barely masking his distaste. "What can I get for you?" he asked, his tone flat and dismissive. Joseph smiled politely, unaware of the condescension. "Just a coffee and maybe the house special," he said, pulling out a few crumpled bills from his pocket. Todd's eyes flicked to the money, and his lips curled into a smirk. "You sure you can afford that?" he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Joseph to hear. Joseph's smile faltered, but he chose to ignore the comment. "Yeah, I can," he said quietly, placing the bills on the table. Todd picked up the money, inspecting it like it was counterfeit. "You know," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "we've got a $1 menu if you're short." The jab stung, but Joseph remained composed. "I'm fine with the special," he said, his voice steady but firm. Todd shrugged, tucking the money into his apron. "Suit yourself," he said, walking off to place the order. From across the diner, a few customers noticed the interaction, their whispers filling the air. Joseph sat quietly, his hands folded on the table, the sting of humiliation sinking in. He had experienced judgment before, but tonight felt different, harsher. Moments later, Todd returned, balancing a plate of food with a smirk still playing on his lips. "Here you go," he said, setting the plate down with a little too much force. "Enjoy." Joseph nodded his thanks, though his appetite had dwindled. He picked up his fork, but before he could take a bite, the door to the diner swung open, and a towering figure ducked inside. The atmosphere shifted immediately as the new arrival scanned the room. It was Shaquille O'Neal. The former NBA superstar and cultural icon strode into the diner, his presence commanding attention. Heads turned and murmurs filled the air as people whispered excitedly. But Shaq wasn't just there for a meal, he was there for Joseph. The moment Shaq spotted Joseph, his face broke into a warm smile. "Pops," he called out, his deep voice carrying across the diner. Joseph looked up, his expression lighting up with a mix of surprise and joy. "Shaquille," he said, standing as Shaq approached the table. Shaq wrapped his arms around Joseph in a bear hug, the kind that could crush bones but was filled with love. The entire diner watched in stunned silence as the connection between the two became clear. Todd, who had been watching from behind the counter, froze. His smirk vanished, replaced by a look of disbelief. "Wait, that's your son?" he stammered, stepping closer to the table. Shaq turned to Todd, his towering frame making the waiter shrink back. His smile faded, replaced by an expression that could stop anyone in their tracks. "Yeah," Shaq said firmly. "This is my dad. Why?" The entire diner seemed to hold its breath, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. Todd swallowed hard, realizing that the man he had just disrespected wasn't just anyone. He was the father of one of the most respected and beloved figures in the world. But Shaq wasn't finished, and what he said next would leave everyone in the diner stunned. The diner was silent, all eyes on Shaquille O'Neal as he towered over Todd. The once confident waiter now looked like a deer caught in headlights, his arrogance evaporating under the weight of Shaq's stern gaze. Shaq took a step closer, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "Yeah, this is my dad," he repeated, his tone steady but sharp. Why do you look so surprised? Todd fumbled for words, his face flushing with embarrassment. I didn't mean anything by it, he stammered, trying to backpedal. I didn't know. Shaq's eyes narrowed slightly and he leaned forward, his massive frame making Todd shrink back even further. You didn't know, huh? Shaq said, his voice low but unmistakably firm. You didn't know, so you decided to treat him like he doesn't matter? Todd opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The rest of the diner watched in stunned silence, the tension in the room almost unbearable. Shaq straightened up, his gaze still fixed on Todd. Let me tell you something, he said, his deep voice carrying across the room. Respect isn't about who you think someone is. It's about how you treat every single person you meet. Todd swallowed hard, his face pale as Shaq's words sank in. The other diners, many of whom had witnessed Todd's earlier behavior, nodded quietly in agreement. Shaq turned to his father, his expression softening as he placed a hand on Joseph's shoulder. This man right here, he said, his voice filled with pride, is the reason I'm standing here today. Everything I've achieved, every success I've had, it's because of him. Joseph looked up at his son, his eyes glistening with emotion. You're giving me too much credit, son, he said quietly. You did all that yourself. Shaq shook his head, smiling warmly. No, Pops. You taught me how to be strong, how to be humble, and how to treat people right. That's what matters. The room seemed to exhale collectively, the heartfelt moment cutting through the tension like a ray of light. Todd, still rooted to the spot, looked like he wanted to disappear. But Shaq wasn't done. He turned back to Todd, his expression serious. You've got a job to do here, he said firmly. It's not just about serving food. It's about treating people with respect, no matter who they are or what they look like. You think you can handle that? Todd nodded quickly, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Shaq studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Good, he said simply, because you just got a lesson in what happens when you judge someone without knowing their story. The entire diner erupted into quiet applause, the tension melting into admiration for Shaq and his powerful words. Todd stepped back, his head hanging low as he tried to process what had just happened. Joseph, still standing, looked around the room, his humble demeanor unchanged. Thank you, son, he said softly. But you didn't have to do all that. Shaq grinned, wrapping an arm around his father. Pops, he said, his voice warm, I'm always going to stand up for you. Always. As they sat back down, the diner began to return to normal, but the air was charged with a new sense of respect. The lesson Shaq had delivered lingered with everyone who had witnessed it, and for Todd, the encounter was a moment he would never forget. As the diner began to settle, whispers of admiration and awe filled the air. Shaq and Joseph sat together at the corner booth, their conversation quiet but filled with warmth. The connection between father and son was undeniable, and everyone in the room could feel the gravity of what had just happened. Meanwhile, Todd stood by the counter, his hands shaking as he wiped down a tray. The confrontation had left him rattled, but more than that, it had left him thinking. He couldn't get Shaq's words out of his head. Respect isn't about who you think someone is. It's about how you treat every single person you meet. One of the older waitresses, a kind woman named Marlene, who had worked at the diner for years, approached Todd. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her voice soft. You okay, Todd? Todd nodded, though his expression was far from confident. Yeah, he muttered. I messed up. Big time. Marlene sighed, her eyes filled with both understanding and disappointment. You've got a lot to learn, kid, she said, but you've been given a rare chance to see the impact of your actions and to make it right. Todd glanced toward the corner booth, where Shaq and Joseph were laughing quietly. I don't even know how to fix it, he admitted. What do I say to him? Marlene gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Start with an apology, she said simply, and mean it. Todd took a deep breath, summoning the courage to do what he knew was right. With shaky steps, he approached the booth, clutching the edge of his apron like a lifeline. Joseph noticed him first, his kind eyes meeting Todd's nervous gaze. Mr. Toney, Todd began, his voice trembling slightly, I wanted to say I'm sorry for how I treated you earlier. It was wrong, and I was an idiot." Joseph looked at Todd for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, a warm, forgiving smile that seemed to melt away the tension. "Son," he said gently, "we all make mistakes. The important thing is that you learn from them." Todd blinked, surprised by Joseph's graciousness. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I promise. I'll do better." Shaq, who had been watching the interaction quietly, leaned back in his seat and crossed his arms. "That's a good start," he said, his tone serious but not unkind. "But don't just say it, show it, every single day." Todd nodded quickly, his resolve hardening. "I will," he said firmly. "Thank you, both of you." Joseph extended a hand, and Todd shook it with gratitude, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. As Todd walked away, the room seemed lighter, as if a subtle shift had occurred, not just in Todd, but in everyone who had witnessed the scene. Back at the counter, Marlene smiled knowingly. "See? That wasn't so hard," she said. Todd nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I guess not," he said, "but I've got a lot to work on." Meanwhile, Shaq turned back to Joseph, his grin wide. "You've still got that magic, Pops," he said, laughing, "turning enemies into friends." Joseph chuckled, shaking his head. "I didn't do anything, son. You're the one who made them listen." Shaq shrugged, his smile softening. "It's easy to listen when the truth is loud enough." The two sat in silence for a moment, their bond unspoken but deeply felt. But the night wasn't over yet. An unexpected gesture was about to leave everyone in the diner reflecting on the true meaning of respect and family. As the atmosphere in the diner settled, Shaq glanced around, taking in the quiet hum of conversations and the occasional curious glances still directed his way. Despite the commotion earlier, the diner had returned to its cozy rhythm. But Shaq wasn't finished. He leaned forward across the table toward Joseph, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Pops," Shaq said with a grin, "how about we turn this whole night around? You've done enough cooking for me when I was a kid. Let's get the whole place a meal on me." Joseph chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't have to do all that, Shaquille." "I don't have to," Shaq said, leaning back with a wide smile. "But I want to. It's about making a moment memorable." Shaq waved over Marlene, who approached with a curious smile. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Better than all right," Shaq said, pulling out his wallet. "I want to cover everyone's bill tonight. Everything. Food, drinks, dessert. Just make sure they know it's on me." Marlene's eyes widened, her mouth falling open in surprise. "All of it?" she asked, glancing around at the tables filled with customers. "All of it," Shaq said firmly. "And make sure Todd gets some of that tip money, too. He's got a second chance to make things right." The room buzzed with excitement as the news spread. Customers exchanged delighted whispers, their faces lighting up with disbelief and gratitude. The staff, who had been quietly watching the interaction, broke into smiles, their admiration for Shaq growing tenfold. Joseph, watching the joy ripple through the room, smiled and shook his head. "You always know how to make an exit," he said with a laugh. Shaq grinned. "It's not about the exit, Pops. It's about the impact." As the staff scrambled to tally up the bills and inform the customers, Todd approached the counter where Marlene was sorting through receipts. He hesitated before asking, "Is he really doing this? Covering everything?" Marlene smiled warmly. "He is, and he made sure you'd get a share of the tips." Todd's face softened, a mix of gratitude and humility washing over him. "I don't deserve that," he said quietly. "Maybe not," Marlene replied, "but you've got a chance to show you do, starting now." Meanwhile, Shaq and Joseph made their way to the door. Customers called out thank yous, their voices filled with warmth and appreciation. Shaq waved back casually, his grin wide and infectious. As they stepped into the cool night air, Joseph turned to his son, his voice soft. "You didn't have to do all that, son," he said, "but I'm proud of you." Shaq wrapped an arm around Joseph's shoulder. "You taught me everything I know, Pops. Treating people right, standing up for what's fair. That's all you." The two walked off into the night, leaving behind a diner filled with happy customers, inspired staff, and a story no one would soon forget. For everyone who had witnessed the night's events, it was more than just a gesture of generosity. It was a powerful reminder of how respect, humility, and second chances could transform lives. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartfelt stories that remind us of the power of kindness, family, and respect. Stay tuned for more incredible moments like this.